Are you reading the latest Chainsaw Man? If so, this video might be for you. And if so, you might be having the same thoughts that I'm having, and that's part one's a really far cry from part two, and both parts are drastically different. And I'm starting to wonder, was the hype around Chainsaw Man ever real? Is it really as good as we thought it was, or at least I thought it was? In this video, I dive into the differences between part one and part two, and whether Chainsaw Man is actually the hype that it is. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Animel. If this is your first time here and you haven't been here before, I'm Mel, the host of this channel. If you're currently an anime only or still on part one of Chainsaw Man, then please know that there are some strong spoilers coming ahead if you choose to continue watching from here on out. But if you're familiar with the story of Chainsaw Man, then you know that one, the manga is split between two parts. There's a part one and a part two. Between part one and part two, there's about a 1 year gap or several months gap. And three, the way that the story is being told feels very, very different. How different? Well, let's start with part one. The way that part one is constructed is mostly to lay a foundation for Denji's character, the main character for Chainsaw Man. Denji is a character that's had a mostly very miserable life and is just looking for the simplest aspects of happiness, just like having a warm meal, or a bed to sleep in, or a place to call home. Part one allows us to explore that backstory, along with learn what Denji's motives are and what motivates him to essentially be Chainsaw Man and how he became Chainsaw Man. It also introduces us to a lot of first experiences for Denji, like his first kiss, or his first pseudo-girlfriend, or first person that's ever been romantically interested in him. In addition to that, it introduces a pseudo type of family for Denji via Aki and Power. And part one ends up being all about how he's looking for basic happiness, is some way able to attain that simple happiness, but then it is all ripped away from him by Makima, who is hoping to make Chainsaw Man the ultimate, I guess, devil hunter to kill the death demon or the war demon. I can't remember which one it is. It ends up being this really fast-paced, intense, and basically neck-breaking story. And I think that kind of adds to some of the allure for some of the fans, at least it did for me, along with some excessively violent and gory scenes that lack censorship. Chainsaw Man has some very similar approaches to violence and perhaps a little bit in the storytelling aspect to Jujutsu Kaisen and Hell's Paradise. The three together have kind of earned the moniker of the Dark Trio, which I did a video on earlier last year. I was going to say this year, so check that one out. And I feel like the story is so fast moving that even though it has nearly 100 chapters in part one, it feels like a much shorter read. Like, I felt like it was 50 chapters that I was reading. And perhaps that's due to the fact that there seems to always be a minimalism in dialogue when it comes to Chainsaw Man, just due to the intense and furious action scenes that Fujimoto Sensei draws. And with some of these aspects alone that I've mentioned, I feel like it's made part one so popular, and that's what's given Chainsaw Man the hype that has always been going on online and been able to push it across the line for it to get an anime adaptation. It's also a pretty simplistic, straightforward storyline where we know what Denji wants, we know what Denji's trying to accomplish, and we know who the main villain is, at least until the plot twist. It's all about Denji getting rid of the Gun Devil, and it obviously turns out that Makima is kind of the villain at the end, and the Gun Devil was kind of a sub-villain. I think a pretty simple and straightforward storyline like this makes it really easy to accumulate hordes of fans. And I can't but not mention Aki and Power. I think Aki and Power are one of my favorite characters within part one, and sadly we end up losing them, because these people end up building this pseudo family with Denji, and also it adds some, I guess, depth to the story in some ways, since the story feels very surface level in part one. Aki is kind of like this big brother to Denji, and I feel like as fans, or personally for me, I feel like I can draw a lot of humanity from Aki, which makes the story more emotional. And then Power's dynamic with Denji is kind of like very little sistery, so it makes the story really fun and captivating, and a little bit lighter in some ways when it's really heavy and intense. And if Aki and Power were not your favorite characters, Part 1 had a large host and diversity amongst its characters that you end up liking others along the way. Jujutsu Kaisen and Hell's Paradise, Fujimoto Sensei's ability to just kill off well-loved characters, I think, is different. And I think fans enjoy being miserable by it. Is that the best way to say it? I'm not really sure. But I guess it's interesting to see a mangaka when it kind of breaks the rules a little bit, where the fave characters don't get to live and don't have plot armor and essentially can die at any moment. So I guess there's always the element of suspense that keeps us going. So far, I've stated everything that comprises of Part 1, and I think what made Part 1 so enjoyable. Now, here's the kink in everything. Since Part 1 is what made us fans of Chainsaw Man in the first place, and Part 2 is such a far cry, is Chainsaw Man, I beg to ask, any good? Or, let's not say any good, but as good as we think it is. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, between Part 1 and Part 2, there's some substantial time between them before Fujimoto Sensei released Part 2. And after a long wait for Part 2, we get introduced to a new character at the start of Chainsaw Man Part 2. It's Mikata Asa. From this point forward, for a few couple dozen chapters, the story is told via Asa. And my biggest problem with that was that with so much time having been passed and being so curious about what would happen to Denji after he lost everyone in Part 1, we don't get much of that in the beginning. And I'm just like, what the f is going on? The beginning of Chainsaw Man is very similar to you turning the corner and expecting to see continued sidewalk, and instead there's a big gaping hole and you suddenly fall through it and you're wondering, how did you get here? And it took, I want to say, about 30 something chapters for me to realize what Fujimoto Sensei was doing. For Part 2, Fujimoto Sensei has taken a different approach by creating a slower paced story, laying a different type of foundation for Denji. He does so by introducing Asa, who is a parallel character of sorts to Denji, both in similarities and differences. It gives us a bit of context as to Asa's background and the struggles that she's had, I guess, assimilating with society. Through Asa, we see the similarities in how both her and Denji just seem to struggle everywhere they go. And just trying to attain small aspects of happiness is really difficult. However, they both contrast in the sense that Denji is a very carefree character and kind of does what Denji does. And Asa struggles a lot more, so much so that she hesitates to take action even at the cost of her own life. And you can see that demonstrated during the famine arc, where she almost wants to die because she feels like she has nothing to live for and life is just miserable. And Chainsaw Man, whom she hates, comes and saves her. So it feels like Fujimoto Sensei is doing something interesting here. He's building a more complex storyline in which we see Asa perhaps being a means to help Denji and Denji to help Asa, vice versa, in what they're struggling with. And you could kind of see this happen as Denji helping Asa continue to live gives her the motivation to help Chainsaw Man out and decides to fight in his place when he disappears. In the later part of Part 2 of Chainsaw Man, we get to see Asa use her abilities in the absence of Chainsaw Man to help others, and she kind of does it as a way of helping Chainsaw Man indirectly. So here we could kind of see Asa playing a part in hopefully Denji's development, because if you really think about it, Denji acquires the abilities to be Chainsaw Man in Part 1. Even though this enables him to continue living on so that he can realize his dreams, being Chainsaw Man obviously comes with a cost. And this cost is that people are always after him as Chainsaw Man. So can he ever truly acquire everything that's supposed to bring him happiness? Or will it be at the cost of losing Chainsaw Man? And this is a dynamic that's explored currently in Part 2 of Chainsaw Man. So we've got this new level of depth now that requires the readers to think a little bit more. It's not as straightforward, and there's this catch-22 going on here. Because while Denji wants to attain these things like getting a girlfriend, there is also being Chainsaw Man, because he also loves being Chainsaw Man, as seen in the latest chapter 152. After holding back for a long time from being Chainsaw Man, he just decides to let it rip and he says, it all. Because being Chainsaw Man is like massages. It hurts, but in the right way. By chapter 152, you've kind of seen that Denji has finally snapped, and we don't know what's going to happen with him going forward, obviously, because we're not writing the story, and I would say Fujimoto Sensei's style of writing is very unpredictable. So to sum up part 2 a little bit, what's changed obviously is the method in which the story is being told. It's a lot more chaotic, even though part 1 is just as chaotic. Because it was just really simple and you kind of knew what the end goal was, it felt easier to follow along. With part 2, not so much, because the story has now required the reader to think a little bit more, which I don't mind. I think adding some complexity to the story is also great, but I feel like the manner in which it's being done is really difficult to understand what's even going on. I will say that I am having the hardest time reading part 2 because of that, but luckily all I have is patience, which I feel like is required when you're reading Chainsaw Man. Because if I really think about part 1, the story doesn't become worthwhile until the end, and then it's like, wow, so this is what part 1 was actually all about. And I think that we're approaching something similar with part 2. We probably won't get what this story is about until we see the ending. But I do think overall, along with the simplicity from part 1 making it easier to digest, we also had a wealth of characters in part 1 where each of us could pick out some characters aside from Denji and find an attachment to them, which makes you want to continue the story. Asa is really difficult to kind of continue on with because her character is very unlikable for the first 20 chapters or so. It isn't until she takes up the mantle and starts to become like a secondary Chainsaw Man to some extent that you're like, huh, you know, kind of like Asa. Now, to go back to my question, is Chainsaw Man really worth the hype that it is? Here's for my lukewarm response. I think it's going to depend on the ending of part 2. But personally for me, and based on my preferences in storytelling, Fujimoto Sensei's approach to telling this story is quite hard for me to digest. And I think I was pulled in by the violence and the gravitas in how Fujimoto handled characters, or rather, the life or death of characters. It felt like a really different, new, refreshing story compared to what I'm used to watching and reading, like One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach being the big 3 and kind of being the stepping stones for anime in America at least. I do think that the messaging overall for Chainsaw Man is really good. However, if I could say what would help improve this story for me to actually be at level with where people hype it to be or where I hyped it to be, it would probably be a bridge between part 1 and part 2, or if not a bridge, less time between the stories. So it didn't feel like we were without Denji for so long. It makes you feel like you're really not reading the same story, and it makes it really easy for readers to give up. And the connective tissue between arcs, from my perspective, seems a little less tangible and very loose compared to part 1. But again, this may just be because I don't know where the story is going, whereas part 1 has already finished, and you could kind of see by the end what part 1 was all about. So I just said a lot there. Simple sentences. I think Chainsaw Man is good, but I don't think it's as good as I really thought it was. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on part 1 and part 2. And if you really are still following the story due to the contrasting difference of part 1 and part 2, seeing as most of us fell in love with Chainsaw Man based on part 1. And if you're still reading Chainsaw Man up until this point like I am, let's stick it out, y'all, and see where it ends up, because I am really curious as to where this story is going. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. As I mentioned in the middle of the video, please check out my video on the Dark Trio if you want to see something similar to this video, or check out some of the other videos on my channel too. However, that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining as always and all your support. But this has been another episode of Mel. I am the host Mel. This is me signing off for now. I'll see you all soon. Bye.